We are continuing our discussion today on human rights. We're going to pick up where we left off around the civil rights movement and move into the modern day. This will cap off our first half of the semester, where we're talking largely about political institutions, and the second half, which will begin on next Tuesday, will dive into political behavior. First, we're going to go over the reading, Schuett and Rogowski, and I think Schuett and Rogowski do a really good job in this piece of kind of going over what we talked about on Tuesday, the ramifications of the not the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, specifically Section 5, those are those pre-clearance requirements that I talked about, and what that means for the modern day in terms of electoral participation. And also, remember that Supreme Court case that I told you might want to know because it might be a question on the midterm, Shelby v. Holder, what that means. So, what are Schuett and Rogowski arguing here? Section 5 worked, guys. A law did a thing that it's supposed to. Hooray, case closed, your government works, we can all go home, it's all great. Ignore the shutdown, everything that's happening right now. But in more serious terms here, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act required jurisdictions with histories of discrimination to obtain federal pre-clearance before changing election laws. So these districts that have a history of discriminating along racial lines basically had to check with the federal government and say, hey, Big Borough, is it okay if we change these things? And what they find is that members of Congress representing these pre-clearance districts have a noticeably, or in statistical terms, a significantly more likely chance of favoring civil rights legislation. So it's kind of gone the extra mile here, right? These districts that have a history of discrimination that you think would be against civil rights legislation, not only are they back up to a neutral kind of parity with other districts, right, that did not have this history of discrimination, but they go the extra mile. The representatives in Congress who support these pre-clearance or represent these pre-clearance districts actually support at a higher rate civil rights legislation than other districts do. Woo, yay, it's wonderful. What else do they talk about here? Well, our friend up front here noted that obviously there is a racial component to this. And essentially, we get more responsiveness in representation along civil rights lines in districts that are proportionately more black and proportionately more competitive. What do I mean by a competitive district? Think back to the Congress week. We read Mayhew and the like, and I talked about Fenno and all that. Yes, the election is closer. What is the significance of a closer election? You have two people who are vying for your vote, right? And they know that they need your vote to win. What does that mean that they're going to do? Yes, you're going to be listened to more. Your vote has more impact. So not only are these Section 5 pre-clearances working, not only are they working more in black districts, but these black competitive districts, right? These representatives in Congress are more likely to represent the interests of this group. So we've gone fully around the curve now, right? These districts that were historically racist, right, are now representing black interests at a higher rate than other districts. But there's always a stick that comes with the carrot. What's the stick here in the story? Yes, Shelby v. Holder. This is the empirical backup to that argument that I made last class. Shelby v. Holder, what it specifically does in 2013 is it rules that the formula to determine what districts require pre-clearance from the federal government, that formula is unconstitutional, they argue, or they decide, which basically guts all of Section 5. If the formula cannot be applied, then we can no longer have these pre-clearance requirements, or at least deploy them effectively. If we can't deploy these Section 5 pre-clearance requirements effectively, what does that mean for representing these groups then? They no longer have an interest in keeping their vote. They no longer need to keep their vote because, And again, think back to the Congress week, it's all about rules. Whoever makes the rules of the game is the winner in politics. And if they don't need to check with Big Brother to go and change their election rules, and they can do it ad hoc whenever they wish, then they can just go with the constituencies that they have always liked, and they don't need to listen to these historically disenfranchised Black constituencies. So, a bit of a bummer, but remember what I said last class with civil rights. It is a push and it is a pull. As we give rights, they can also be taken away. This is how they get taken away. Not through, grandiose things, but through small things, like ruling a formula for determining election law updates unconstitutional. It's very mundane, but it's very important. And now, I know you're all so sad. This is your final Constitution corner of the semester. I know you're all crying inside, and it is making me sad too. So let's get into it. What is the 19th Amendment? Yeah! Universal suffrage! Great! Women are now allowed to vote. Congrats, women. You guys worked very hard with, all of the suffragettes and stuff, and now you guys can vote, unless you guys have a history of felonies, or unless local voter ID laws prohibit you from doing so, or unless there's, other things like poll taxes and the like that prevent you from voting, or, a lot of other things that prevent you. But ostensibly, we now have universal suffrage, so that's pretty cool, guys. What is the 24th Amendment? No more poll taxes. I know it's shocking that it took until 1964 to eliminate poll taxes, but in 1964, the states ratified the 24th Amendment, and this is a part of the era with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and obviously, significantly, this is a year after Dr. King's March on Washington, and so poll taxes are thusly banned. And finally, what is the 26th Amendment? Yes. We're in the Vietnam War. It's a pretty shit time for everybody in America. And so they're like, hey guys, if we are old enough to be drafted, I'm saying this from the perspective of a potential person who could be drafted in 1971. Their argument is if we can be drafted at 18, we should also be able to vote at 18. And that seems like a logical enough argument. So they lower the voting age from 21 to 18. How many of you thought that the voting age had always been 18? Come on, you can say. Yeah? We have a few brave souls, and the rest of you are liars. But that's what lowered the voting age. So now that you have all thoroughly read the Constitution, every single piece of it, whenever you get in a debate with someone who says they know their rights, you can say, do you know about the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment and how it applies to selective incorporation? And then, they can punch you in the face because you're being an asshole. So let's dive into issue evolution. So issue evolution, as I use it here, is in fact an actual political science theory. I'm not going to go into that too much. It's part of public policy and framing and the like. Read Carmine and Stimson, their work in the late 80s, if you really care about this. It is not essential for understanding American national government, but it is a helpful frame to think about how the issues of civil rights have evolved over time. We talked a lot about civil rights in relation to race, obviously, and a little bit in relation to women's rights, but obviously this gets expanded into new areas such as education, representation, gay rights, immigration, and of course, couched through all of this is the thing we started with on Tuesday, and the thing that we talked about in the reading, the thing I keep harping on, this central right that you have as a citizen, and that is the right to vote, the franchise. So we kind of ended, despite, the little tirade on Fred Hampton, on a higher note that we were in the 60s, we had the Civil Rights Act, we had the Voting Rights Act, you have a ban on poll taxes in the Constitution, you have the March on Washington, and things seem pretty good. All things around, the motion in the country was towards progress and equality, but this doesn't really last. So in the 60s, you have these landmark laws that have bipartisan support. Sure, you have some what they call blue dog Democrats, who are largely Southern conservative Democrats, who are so called because they met in a room in the Capitol building that had a painting of a blue dog. that are not big fans of it. And sure, you have some Republicans who are more conservative who are not a fan of these acts, but by and large, they had bipartisan support for the Civil Rights Act. But over time, you have racial politics that fracture this consensus. We talked a little bit about this when I brought up Brown v. Board in the 50s, but there needed to be policies of forced busing to actually forcefully desegregate schools, not just in the South, but often between wealthier suburbs, even in the North, and more Black and Latino inner cities. The South also starts this thing along with the GOP being the Republican Party at this time, called the Southern Strategy, where they start to target more conservative historical Democrats in the South to subtly spark white backlash to the 1960s advances through coded language. So this change from outright, you have the classic segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, and then that turns into things like talking about law and order, states' rights, and the like. These things today are often referred to as dog whistles. At the time, it was an evolution of language to strategically appeal to these constituencies that felt left behind after this, or threatened after this 1960s advance. And so you have this evolution of civil rights from something that was bipartisan and not even necessarily geographically polarized, as there were strong advocates in the South, despite the fact that Jim Crow largely operated in the South, to something that falls along partisan cleavages. This also develops into this concept called symbolic racism, and this is from Sears and Friends. So explicit racial prejudice was kind of pushed out of what was commonly acceptable in American language, particularly among ruling political elites, along with the Southern Strategy appealing to those seemingly disaffected constituencies in the South. You have this development of what the scholarship calls symbolic racism. This involves subtle beliefs that minorities violate traditional values rather than overt racial animus. So the idea that they violate the American value of hard work or lawfulness. Politicians exploited this shift through coded appeals, talking about famously welfare queens, crime, illegal aliens, and illegals instead of race directly. And this then gets into these policies that, while not overtly framed through racial lines, are in fact subversively framed through racial lines. And this backlash shaped how we talked about welfare, housing, and policing up to the modern day, but particularly up through the end of the 20th century. That's how you get someone like Bill Clinton, an ostensible Democrat, but a free market capitalist, coming in and proposing his Welfare Reform Act, who his economic advisor at the time, Peter Edelman, a respected economist, actually resigned in rage over, and then proceeded to spend the next 30 years writing books about how much he hated Bill Clinton. I like this figure because it has some good little kind of snippets of what this language can look like. The fact notion that racism is dead, we're in a post-racial society. The fact that demands for equality go too far. Remember what King was saying in Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Demands for more than they deserve. There is this notion, John Rawls, the veil of ignorance. This is applied to welfare policy. Basically, assume that you are about to be born and you have no idea who you are going to be, whether you are born into a rich family or a poor family. You want to design policy behind this veil of ignorance, assuming that you have a chance of being born into that poor family, and you want to help yourself that way. That's the veil of ignorance, right? The alternative form of this is frames of deservingness, right? Where you have the other side where it's, well, what do you really deserve? You deserve what you work for in practice. So demands more than they deserve, and then inequality due to failure to work hard. It is a personal responsibility problem, not actually a societal issue that we need to deal with to actually reach a more equitable future. And if you're interested, I do have a ton of scholarship on that I can loan you, books and the like. So that's where my dissertation rests. Kind of diving into public opinion and political behavior a little bit, we have a few interesting notions in the scholarship that I want to run by you. Obviously, racial identity shapes politics. Historically, political strategists have used the phrase demographics are destiny. They're talking about the fact that historically, after the Civil Rights Act and all of that, up through the late 20th century and even into the early 21st century, Black people predominantly were Democrats, and white people could predominantly be Republicans, particularly educated white people at the time, though that has changed a lot under Donald Trump's more economically populist message. But the notion was demographics were destiny. Racial identity shaped politics. It's baked into American history. And from that, you get this idea of linked fate. It's produced largely among Black communities, but also exists to some lesser extent in other racial communities. Let me pause here and explain this a little bit. Linked fate is the notion that believing that your individual well-being is tied to the group's well-being. So, if I am an Irish Catholic in Boston, I believe that my well-being as an Irish Catholic is tied to the well-being of the other Irish Catholics around me. So I should support policies that are pro-Irish Catholics at large, not just pro-me, even though our lives might be slightly different. That is an extrapolation of it. Historically, this has been applied largely to Black communities, and linked fate has been shown to exist among Black communities in America. The idea that an individual who is a Black person feels a certain camaraderie with other Black people as well. This is less prominent in our other large but fastest growing minority group in America, Latinos, simply because Latinos have a much higher sense of national identity than Black individuals do. If they immigrate from Cuba, for instance, they're going to have a much different sense of what being Latino is than someone who immigrates from Venezuela, or someone who immigrates from El Salvador, or Peru, or Paraguay. All of those are inherited national identities, and so you have a larger difference and disconnect between them. Linked fate does not exist among white people. Part of that, and we'll get into this in the political psychology unit, is because white people don't really see themselves as a group. They see themselves as a baseline in America from which we compare other groups to. This leads to polarization in racial attitudes. So if you have a Black individual who feels linked fate with other Black individuals, and those other Black individuals are supporting a party that represents them to a degree, and they think that they can change that, they glom onto Democrats, then that is going to shift politics en masse towards that kind of party. This also leads to persistent gaps in trust between racial groups, the government, police, and institutions. There is a large gap in trust among the mass public between Black individuals, of course, and the police, based on historical abuse from the police, but also in government as a whole. There are a lot of interesting studies that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic because of a history of, for instance, the Tuskegee experiments, where the American government infected a bunch of African Americans without them knowing with syphilis, I believe. They felt anxious about the vaccine coming to their communities. This is something that they feel. We also, I imagine, will start to see a bunch of studies talking about government trust in Latino communities coming out of this new immigration policy, particularly because Latinos, by and large, shifted towards Donald Trump in the last election massively. And as we know in the scholarship, if a group shifts towards an individual in an election and then that individual seemingly betrays their trust, that is felt in the long term. So women's rights did not end in 1920 when the 19th Amendment passed. In 1972, you get Title IX, which prohibited discrimination along the lines of sex in education, opening opportunities in both athletics and academics. Workplace discrimination laws started passing too that targeted pay gaps and sexual harassment. Obviously, we have Roe v. Wade in 1973 that established abortion rights, later overturned in Dobbs v. Jackson, leaving that option up to the states to change. And most recently, you have the Me Too movement starting in the mid to late 2010s, when open discussions of personal experiences of sexual assault and harassment became much more publicly acceptable to talk about. These are images from the famous Women's March in Donald Trump's first term, at which point the Republican Party memed the little pink cats to death afterwards. At the same time, you also have LGBTQ rights. I'm going to start with a point in time, as I did with Seneca Falls last class, but this certainly is not the beginning of their struggle for rights. You have Stonewall in 1969. Does anyone know what happened at Stonewall? It was a riot. The police came in, raided a gay bar. Gays did not like it. There was a riot. This is a picture from that. And that leads us up through what really sparks a history of gay activism after that. In the 70s, you have individuals like Harvey Milk in San Francisco. He was the mayor in San Francisco and was assassinated. You also have breakthroughs like Lawrence v. Texas. Lawrence v. Texas is an interesting case. How many of you did not know that it was illegal to have gay sex in America until 2003? Yeah, you could not have gay sex in America until 2003, specifically in Texas. Basically, in Lawrence v. Texas, the Supreme Court struck down anti-sodomy laws. Anti-sodomy laws technically applied to everyone, but let's be honest, it's targeting gay people. And then, of course, in 2015, you have the Supreme Court case Obergefell v. Hodges that enshrines gay marriage as a subsidiary right under which amendments? You guys are experts in the Constitution now. Which one's the safety valve? Yes. Well, they integrated it through the Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Which one is the safety valve? James Madison talked about this. Yes! Through the 9th Amendment. Through the 9th and the 14th Amendment, as well as a whole host of others. Remember, this is kind of the implied right to privacy that we talked about, so it doesn't necessarily exist in text, and so they justify it through a broad scope of other constitutional provisions. And this also leads us up to the moment with the ongoing debates over trans rights. Transgender people are a shockingly limited population in America, but have gotten a lot of scrutiny of late. Democratic strategists have been shitting themselves and discussing whether or not Kamala Harris lost the election because she was in support of trans rights. That seems a bit myopic to me from a political strategy perspective, but, I'm not a political strategist. I'm here earning less than minimum wage teaching government courses, so I guess they figured it out and I didn't. Let's talk about immigration. So immigration sits at the intersection of identity and civil rights. You have undocumented youth called dreamers. They are the children of undocumented immigrants. They won temporary protection under DACA, the Deferred Action for Children of Aliens. I don't know exactly what it's called. In 2012, basically saying we're not going to try to deport these children because they didn't really have a choice in coming here. They're children. But permanent reform remains elusive for them. Of course, we've seen a ton of backlash. One of the largest discussions, or one of the largest points of Donald Trump's re-election campaign, was mass deportations, which a majority of the country in polls said they supported. A majority of the country no longer supports them. now that they see what it involves, but at the time, a majority of the country supported that, including the potential for DACA. Obviously, deporting Dreamers. Obviously, in practice, the family separation policies under the first Trump administration continued under the Biden administration, and of course, continued to be adopted under the second Trump administration. Kind of brought teeth out of DACA. Again, laws are only as powerful as those who enforce them. And an important note is that Latino politics are rising in importance in America. They are a demographic group for which both parties are really struggling hard to get a hold of because they seem winnable to both sides. As I said, Latino groups really shifted in their support toward the Republican Party in the last election, when historically they have supported Democrats. So we'll see where that goes. They are an important constituent group to care about. And all of this, of course, comes back to voting rights. So if Latino politics are becoming important, we see people start to vie more for the black vote after the preclearance provisions of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. These are important. Obviously, voting rights are somewhat being stripped back right now in general. I don't mean that as a political statement. I mean that as a fact. We know Shibley Counter v. Holder passed. Since then, we also see a rise in voter ID laws. Now, voter ID laws, I think, are a commonly misunderstood thing among the public. Voter ID laws are like any law, and I hope you take away from this after our last discussion. Like any law, they are not impartial things that just exist. Every law serves a purpose, a political purpose. Voter ID laws also come along with purges of voter lists and limits on early voting. And what this does is it disproportionately disenfranchises the underrepresented and the poor. And of course, the poor overlaps with a lot of these historically disenfranchised groups as well. Why might having a requirement for voter ID inhibit someone who is legally here and legally allowed to vote from exercising their vote? There is an opportunity cost to voting. Who here studies economics or business? You're going to learn a lot about opportunity cost and the like in your basic macro and microeconomics course. There's an opportunity cost to voting. You have to do it in most jurisdictions in person, unless you are a member of the military or your state allows remote voting, or as in mail-in voting. So there's a cost in time. You have to go to your polling place to vote. There's a cost in time and labor and learning about who you need to vote for. There is a cost in terms of finances. A lot of polling places end up opening in hours when people are working, whether in the evening or during the day, or through childcare that you need to get your child to cover. There's an opportunity cost in terms of finances in getting you there. You need to pay for a bus pass, or you need to pay to get there. You need to do all of these things. All of those are already impediments to voting that a lot of people see just isn't worth it to surmount those. That's the baseline. If you add in another thing where you need to make sure you have the correct ID, the correct documentation, that then adds yet another impediment. And the goal is not to turn away people who are there to vote. The goal is to make the process cumbersome enough that people just don't think it's worth the trouble. And you might say, well, it's not hard to go find those documents and get those documents and, follow along and do what you're supposed to do. But here's the thing, as we have learned by all of the silences in the news segments where I ask you about what's going on in the news, most American people don't pay attention to what's happening in politics. They don't know when laws are getting updated for these things. So it just creates mass confusion. Voter ID laws are a way of disenfranchising people through making the administrative burden, remember that term from the time we talked about bureaucracy, from making the administrative burden of voting too taxing for the people who get to vote. Obviously, we've talked a lot about gerrymandering too, with this gerrymandering arms race that's going on right now, but gerrymandering remains pervasive, entrenching partisan and racial divisions in turnout. Now, racial gerrymandering is illegal under the Constitution, but as we've established, racial lines often graft onto partisan lines. This, I like this figure a lot. This is a figure that's basically in every AP government textbook, or at least used to be about a decade ago when I was in high school. And I think it's a great way to show spatially how gerrymandering works, right? So if you have 40% red and 60% blue, you think en masse an election should go blue. Now, say blue is in charge, they're going to gerrymander it to their favor. You think, well, 40% red, they're still going to get some representation. Well, blue can see, we're going to block them all, even though these look representative, right? These look like they are made equally. What happens is all of these subsquares here, more of them are blue than red, so then you have all 100% blue representation. But even though red is 40% of the population, they can also gerrymander this in such a way that they then win 3 seats and have a majority, even though they don't have a numeric majority. So we've talked about all this burden, and it leads to turnout gaps. Who turns out to vote? If they see all of this burden, it's already, wired against us for us to lose. Already we have to do all of this stuff, and I don't fully understand all these laws. I don't want to accidentally commit a crime, so I'm just not even going to bother. I already have to deal with my kid and pick them up from school and all this, and then they're whining because they want the iPad, and it's just crazy. Participation gaps happen. So you see that participation gaps happen along gendered lines. Women vote less than men, though that is less of a problem now than it used to be. There are gaps along racial lines at a rate where, minorities vote less than white folks, though that is somewhat lessening. And the largest gap is along socioeconomic lines. Poor people just vote less than wealthier people. And it's simply because that opportunity cost is felt more among poorer people. Let's get back to race here. So affirmative action policies were designed to counter systemic exclusion in education and employment. We all understand what affirmative action is, right? This can either be through like a quota system that out of, 100 jobs that you have posted, 10% of them need to go to historically disenfranchised groups, or, 10 of those seats in a graduating class need to be given to historically disenfranchised members of a racial group. This all makes sense to people. Yes, we understand affirmative action. Yes, I like a few nods. The rest of you look like you want to gouge your eyeballs out with a grapefruit spoon. There is, of course, controversy over fairness here, right? So if, and this has come to the Supreme Court many times, I am a white applicant for a medical school or something, and I meet all of the requirements and am just as qualified as a myriad of other candidates, but because there is a quota for the number of black students who have to get into this medical school, a less qualified candidate gets in over me. This is not, in fact, how affirmative action usually works, and even so, affirmative action is usually about measuring potential rather than actual current acumen, as in justifying or writing past injustices by letting these individuals live up to the potential that is inherent to them that was not given to them because of systemic inequality. However, there are clear arguments that this is unfair. This culminates in the most recent case, Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard and UNC in 2023. Which basically was a group of Asian students, oddly enough, who came forward and said that affirmative action policies limited their availability to get into certain colleges, UNC and Harvard being the defendants in this case. And they won. Affirmative action in college admissions is unconstitutional. Colleges cannot do this anymore. You guys were probably affected by this as one of the first freshman incoming classes to have to apply when there was no racial checkbox, or at least there shouldn't have been on your application. If there was, that's a problem for the University of South Carolina's lawyers, not me. The future of what this looks like is unclear, right? So in terms of college admissions counselors are now coaching candidates who are from racial backgrounds that have historically been disenfranchised and minoritized and not given the opportunities of white people to instead of checking the race box in their essay, signify something about their race. Sure, they can't say, I am a black person, you should admit me because I am a black person, but rather talk about systemic struggles that they have faced in their admission essay as a cue to the to the admissions officer that they should get them in. Because here's the thing, colleges are still largely operating under business-focused models, and it is still more profitable for them to be seen as a diverse institution than it isn't. That's simply where the market condition is for them. They can attract more people by saying, hey, look, we are a diverse collegiate population. So of course they're going to figure out loopholes in order to inflate their bottom line if they can. It's just good business. I've talked about descriptive representation a lot before versus symbolic representation, but we're going to have a final word on it. Civil rights aren't only about policy, but about who governs. Descriptive representation, of course, is having officials who share constituents' identities. It has symbolic effects, right, where you can increase legitimacy and trust of an institution, as well as substantive effects. That's agenda setting and advocacy. And of course, as we have talked about time and time again, we're not at parity. We're not at perfect descriptive representation. That's not a goal that anyone actually has. This is the 118th Congress, broken down by race and ethnicity. We can see that the Democrats are a more racially diverse party than Republicans are. With a few interesting notes, we have the same amount of American Indians in both parties, which I thought was neat. A fun little fact there. But as we see, this belies what I was talking about race falling along partisan cleavages now. Civil rights were bipartisan. Now we have this. This is not necessarily healthy. Now for the depressing slide. This all culminates in contemporary movements, right? Activism and civil rights pushes did not end in the 1960s, and we continue to see them evolve and reform today. The Black Lives Matter movement heightened police brutality and systemic racism, and we saw they mobilized millions of people globally in 2020, but over the course of the Biden administration and overall political fatigue, we see enthusiasm for this movement, at least as a cross-cutting multiracial coalition, really dying down. The scholarship shows that there are lasting effects that are relatively positive for these racial groups and discussions about race, but by and large, support is not where it used to be. We also have Me Too, which confronted sexual harassment and workplace inequality in a very groundbreaking way, not just through pushing for policy and accountability, but also in just changing the language of how we talk about these things, making it permissible in the public space to talk about these things that happened. But again, we see less fervor for this now than we used to. I don't know if any of you remember or are old enough to remember, around 2017 there was talks about reviving the Equal Rights Amendment and really pushing this all the way and trying to get as far as we possibly can, but identitarian politics are fatiguing and people are losing interest. Trans rights activism along LGBTQ lines challenged discrimination in healthcare, education, and the law, but almost as soon as that came up as a nascent political movement, you have seen attacks from all sides on this group without having the kind of airing of possible fruitful policy avenues that we saw around gay marriage throughout the 90s and early 2000s. There's far more concern about how damaging they are as a political group to include in your coalition than there is in the actual civil rights discussions happening. And finally, environmental justice movement has done a very good job historically in linking race and poverty and pollution all together and in order to demand equitable access to clean air and water and a clean future for our children. And it was a very bipartisan thing. Never forget, a Republican created the Environmental Protection Agency. It was George H.W. Bush who said that environmentalism and conservation was a Republican ideal, and now it has been basically pushed to the side because of a lot of other more pressing identitarian issues, as well as, I have hinted at before, overall fatigue with all of these politics. So, as I have said, rights ebb and they flow. Activism also ebbs and it flows. We are in a new era here where, sure, we have seen pushes in the past that have moved the needle, that were able to get this grassroots mobilization together to advance civil rights, but we are in a new era with new technologies, new modes of communication that have really changed a lot of how we interact, and the political consequences, particularly related to people's lack of interest and continuing fatigue with these, and the sheer insurmountability, it seems, of overcoming the odds might have killed some of these movements. So let's talk about takeaways here. Civil rights didn't end in the 1960s. They evolve into new forms. What we see today are struggles for civil rights. The civil rights movement isn't just something that happened in the 1960s. There are new identities, gay people, women have been around forever, or so I've been told, but, they're more permissible forms of feminism today, trans rights, and new economic movements. All are talking about the same things that we have been talking about forever: basic human fundamental rights. Remember, the struggle for civil rights is a combination of law through legislation and the courts, but also activism. And finally, equality is a project that remains unfinished. Remember those three questions that I talked about: who gets what, how far they can exercise those rights, and what rights are guaranteed. Those are all questions that are still up in the air. I include a picture of John Lewis here because John Lewis, civil rights leader and then member of Congress, pushed for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to put teeth back into the 1965 Voting Rights Act. That has been shot down time and time again, and then John Lewis sadly passed away a couple years ago. But he had been fighting his entire life for rights that he never got to see actually enshrined in any constantly meaningful way that would be enshrined forever in the future.